There's a particular kind of silence that defined an entire generation's childhood. Not the comfortable silence of a Saturday morning with nowhere to be. The other kind. The kind where you come home to an empty house, drop your backpack by the door, make yourself a snack, and figure out what's for dinner. You were maybe 9, maybe 10, and nobody had asked you if you were okay with this arrangement. It was just how things were. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you probably know exactly what I'm describing. And if you're sitting there right now thinking, yeah, that was just Tuesday, then this might be the first time someone has named what that actually did to you. Both the cost of it and the quiet gift buried inside. Because here's the thing about Generation X that almost nobody talks about, honestly. They didn't just survive neglect, they built an entire psychology around it. And that psychology, the self reliance, the skepticism, the almost allergic reaction to being oversold anything, it didn't come from nowhere. It came from being left alone long enough to have to figure things out without a manual, without a hotline, without a parent waiting to process the experience with them afterward. Let me paint you a picture that might feel uncomfortably familiar. The average Gen X kid in the early 80s had approximately 2 hours of unsupervised time after school every single day before any adult appeared. 2 hours of no oversight, no structured activity, no one checking in. Researchers who later studied this generation called them latchkey kids, which always struck me as a weirdly charming term for something that was actually kind of lonely. You wore the key to your house around your neck like a talisman. You let yourself in. You made your own rules. You handled it. And here's what's fascinating about what that did to the developing brain. When children are repeatedly placed in situations where they must solve problems without adult intervention, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision making, and emotional regulation, gets a different kind of workout than it would in a highly supervised environment. It doesn't necessarily develop faster, it learns to trust itself earlier. It builds what psychologists call internal locus of control, the deep-seated belief that your outcomes are shaped primarily by your own actions, not by luck, authority, or anyone else stepping in at the last moment to save you. Which sounds powerful, and it is mostly. Except it comes with a shadow side that Gen X carries around like a well-worn backpack they never quite figured out how to set down. When your formative years teach you that you're essentially on your own, that adults are distracted, unreliable, or just genuinely unavailable, you stop asking for help. Not because you're proud, because asking starts to feel pointless. You adapt. You internalize. You develop an almost preternatural ability to read a situation, figure out what needs doing, and get it done without making a fuss or expecting applause afterward. But self-sufficiency, when it's learned through absence rather than genuine confidence building, comes with a cost. It tends to make people deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability, quietly suspicious of anyone who seems too enthusiastic, too helpful, or too certain about anything. Because somewhere in the back of that latchkey brain, there's a 9-year-old who learned not to get too attached to things working out the way they're supposed to. And then the world gave Gen X every reason to double down on that instinct. This generation came of age during a period of extraordinary institutional collapse. Watergate, Vietnam, the AIDS crisis, the crack epidemic, corporate downsizing dressed up as innovation and progress. They watched authority figures lie, fail, and disappear with an almost rhythmic consistency. And they responded the way any rational person responds when they keep getting let down by the things they were told to trust. They stopped trusting. Not cynically, pragmatically. There's a real difference between those two things. A cynic says nothing matters. A pragmatist says, I'll believe it when I see it. Gen X became, culturally, a generation of pragmatists, which is why their humor was so dry, so self-aware, so relentlessly ironic. Irony is armor. It lets you care about something deeply while also being protected from the embarrassment of having cared if it doesn't work out. It's actually kind of brilliant, if a little exhausting to maintain for 30 years. There's a reason Kurt Cobain's voice cracking the way it did felt like something landing in your chest. There's a reason reality bites and Clerks and Singles felt less like movies and more like dispatches from inside your own skull. Not because Gen X was uniquely depressed, but because they were unusually honest about disappointment in a culture that was still aggressively trying to sell them the dream. They looked at the promise and went, yeah, I'm not sure I'm buying that. And they said so. In art, in music, in the very specific, practiced way they rolled their eyes at anything that smelled like corporate sincerity. But here's the reframe I want to sit with you for a moment. That skepticism, that hard-won, sometimes lonely, often underappreciated ability to function without validation, without constant feedback, without a roadmap handed to them by someone who cared? It turns out that's not just a trauma response masquerading as a personality. Well, it is, partly, but it's also something real, something earned, something that looks from the outside like a kind of quiet and extraordinary resilience. The psychological research on adversity is nuanced, and I want to be careful here not to romanticize difficulty. Not every kid who came home to an empty house built something useful from that experience. Some of them just got lonely and stayed that way, and that matters. That deserves to be said out loud too. But for many in this generation, the particular shape of their childhood produced adults who are genuinely comfortable with ambiguity, who don't need to be managed or handheld or constantly reassured, who figure things out, who have quietly and almost entirely without fanfare been holding things together for the people around them for decades now. There's a kind of invisible labor that Gen X performs almost automatically. They're the ones who show up, who handle the logistics when something falls apart at the worst possible moment, who have already quietly thought through 3 contingency plans before anyone else has even registered that there's a problem. Not because they're controlling, because they grew up in environments where if they didn't think ahead, there was a very real chance nobody else was going to. And now they're somewhere in their 40s and 50s, sandwiched between boomers whose cultural relevance and millennials who are just now coming into their own power. Largely uncelebrated, rarely centered in any conversation, still handling it, still, if they're being honest, a little bit amazed that anyone just asks for help when they need it. Still learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that maybe they're allowed to do that too. If any part of what I've just described feels familiar, I want you to hold one thought before you move on. The fact that you figured it out alone doesn't mean you were supposed to. It means you were capable enough to survive a situation that shouldn't have been entirely yours to carry in the first place. And those are 2 very different stories. One is about your strength, the other is about what you deserved and didn't always get. You can hold both of those things at the same time. Honestly, being able to do exactly that might be the most Gen X thing of all. If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. What part of growing up this way stayed with you the longest? What did you figure out alone that you wish someone had been there for? Sometimes just naming a thing out loud is enough to make it feel a little lighter than it did before.